No president before now has been foolish enough to think that you could get away with levying what is probably going to amount to several $100 billion worth of tax increase every year on the American consumer as a result of all of this.
The UK received the minimum tariff of 10% compared to a 20% tariff on EU exports. Donald Trump said we'll do the same to reflect what the US claims Britain imposes on US imported products. Well, Joe Sternberg is a member of the Wall Street Journal's editorial board and columnist. Good morning.
Good morning.
We've had a little bit of a run through there of what happened overnight, but just set the scene for anybody who didn't watch it in real time. What was this moment like?
It was a strange event to watch. The key thing that jumped out at me is how much like one of his campaign rallies it felt like. And I think that that's actually a very important point about all of this, because there is this real sense that he promised that there was going to be more trade protectionism on the campaign trail last year. So I think that there is a sense in which he feels like he is delivering on that promise, and a lot of his supporters are going to feel like he has delivered on that promise. Now, I mean, you can have a long conversation about the negative effects. I think there's evidence that some Republicans in Washington are starting to get a little nervous about whether all of those Trump voters actually understood what they were voting for in terms of higher prices for American consumers as a result of all of this. But I think that one baseline condition we have to understand here is that tariffs are probably the only thing that Trump has consistently believed in over the course of several decades, and now he is actually doing it. And so I think from that perspective, we probably shouldn't be surprised both that we had this announcement in the first place and also that it had that real carnival, kind of campaign event feel about it once he did announce it.
And we've been talking in the context of that carnival kind of feel. Donald Trump was brandishing quite a big board on which he said, it was reciprocal tariffs was the title, and it explained what each country levied on American imports and what they would then announce on on exports to America. Some people might argue, looking at those figures, you can see there is a disparity. Is it not America's right to introduce at least some kind of reciprocal arrangement if other countries are levying quite high tariffs on the US?
Well, I mean, it's a question of how much of your nose you want to cut off in order to spite your face. The reason that America has not levied this kind of tariff in the past is that we have concluded that we benefited from, the more affordable consumer goods. So, I mean, yeah, you can argue about whether other countries do or don't, restrict imports of American products. I think that that's actually pretty debatable, and they are overestimating a lot of the trade barriers that other countries, particularly the UK and the EU, impose on American exports. But even if you accept that premise, there's always been this problem of what are you going to do about it? And no president before now has been foolish enough to think that you could get away with levying what is probably going to amount to several $100 billion worth of tax increase every year on the American consumer as a result of all of this.
Who's come out of this well, or at least better than other countries? And do we understand the reasoning? I mean, we're talking about the UK context, 10% tariffs compared to 20% for the EU. Many people here are suggesting that's a Brexit bonus. What's your take on the UK tariff and anyone else who seems to have got off more lightly than others?
Well, I think that there's a certain made-up quality to that chart that he put up because, I mean, on the one hand, I think that it is enormously helpful for the UK economy and a sign of Trump's perception of the importance of the special relationship between the US and the UK, that the tariff rate is, quote unquote, only 10% compared to 20% for the EU. But I mean, just if you were looking at it on the policy merits, it's not obvious that EU trade is any more restrictive for US exporters than the UK is right now. So that's actually is an example of how arbitrary this was. Another example, I think Brazil, which is a very heavily protectionist economy, got the 10% base rate. Singapore, which is a free port with no trade restrictions, also got the 10% base rate. So I think that there was kind of an element of there are probably some people in the White House who were working, very scrupulously trying to come up with the precise level of the reciprocal tariff that they wanted to impose here. But I think that there's also this element of just kind of making it up based on what they thought the American public perception of which countries' trade practices are unfair would be, and then going from that.
And is that what's happened in the case of Canada and Mexico? Because they seem to have been, well, if not spared, at least come off lighter than perhaps they maybe thought they would.
Well, I think the key point to remember about Canada and Mexico is that they weren't included in this announcement because they already have their own tariffs. And the White House has been clear that the 25% tariffs that Trump had already imposed on those countries are going to continue as planned. So I think that we shouldn't read too much in the fact that those countries weren't here because they've already been singled out for particularly negative treatment. And I think that it is a sign that Trump here is really stepping back not only from a long-held understanding of America's own self-interest and the desirability of sparing consumers from this kind of tax, but also he's stepping away from America's understanding of how trade policy fit into our broader strategic goals and our desire to, maintain friendships with our neighbors and allies. So this is a very big and negative change.
Yeah, and that's something that we're going to try and explore throughout the show today. Finally, Joe, before we let you go, there's another story overnight that may well be drowned out by some of the tariffs chatter, but it's that Elon Musk is leaving, or at least departing in his current role. Now, there is a suggestion, it's reported by Politico, that this is because Trump allies feel he's unpredictable. The administration's hit back and said there's nothing more to this. He was always going to leave when Doge work was finished. What do you think is the truth at the heart of this story?
Oh, I think that that is going to occupy historians and memoirists for many years after this. But I think that the key point, with both Doge and the tariffs is the element of political risk that I think that Trump has stumbled into, which might be surprising him because a lot of the things that he is doing right now, the trade protectionism, getting a fair deal for America, as he would put it, on the trade front, or slashing government waste, fraud, and abuse with Doge. Those are things that perform very well in opinion polls on a headline level if you just ask voters, hey, do you think we should cut government waste? When you go in to actually do it, it becomes a much more complicated political project. And my sense is that they're discovering that with Doge. They're already going to discover it with the tariffs when there was also evidence yesterday that some Republican senators are very uneasy with this tariff project and tried to vote against some of them. So I think that Trump may be in for a bit of a surprise with the tariff policy in the same way that Doge has had an element of backfire as
Yeah,
voters start understanding what it's actually about.
it's such an important point. Joe, thank you very much. That is Joe Sternberg there from the Wall Street Journal.